Bienvenidos a Vox Terra. Today, I want to highlight a comment a viewer made in my earlier show where I criticized CBS's news coverage of these winter blizzards and other issues as well. And that viewer said, about how a lot of the media is trying to normalize climate change. And that's a great point and something that we don't want to let happen. So what do we mean here by normalize climate change? Well, since these blizzards hit Buffalo, New York, a city that has a reputation for heavy snowfall, it becomes really easy to do that. So let me just walk you through this, that we can put these blizzards in context of our overall heating climate, our overall heating planet, and talk about regional weather patterns in Buffalo, New York as well. So you need two starting points for almost any news event. You got to think that the news media is all very large corporations and wealthy individuals. And what's really weird to me is that Fox News, One America, they try to present themselves as alternatives, but they're not, okay? It's the same, just wealthy people. All right, it's a similar sets of wealthy individuals and large corporations, which are going to have ties to that fossil fuel petrochemical industry. So your part number two should be that if you look right at the NASA website, as it is now anyway, and right there, the planet is heating. It's been heating since the starting of the era of burning of fossil fuels, the Industrial Revolution, getting hotter. That's what set this in motion. But another reason why sometimes it's hard to hear scientists warning about this is the scientific community has something called attribution science and causation rules. Like I believe it's a 90% certainty to causation. At least that's what Naomi Oreskes said. And that means that, it's going to take them years to come out and say, this particular event was climate change. And we've seen this. Years go by and the climate's unraveling. So we need to start with the basics and the basic climate mechanisms. So you can just review some of my shows from spring, summer of 2022. And I believe I started off that season with brutal historic heat waves in Pakistan and India. And I left out Iran and other parts of South Asia. Brutal historic heat wave throughout much of the continental United States. I didn't do a video on brutal historic heat waves hitting China. And then heat sort of pushing up places further north than it used to, like the Seattle, Washington, or the Washington State, Oregon, Pacific Northwest, Vancouver, brutal heat waves in Europe, and those areas that didn't used to be so wildfire prone, like there was wildfires in England in the summer of 2022, wildfires in France, and then also all of the flooding during this time period. I pointed out to you, I did a video on Pakistan, a third of the nation underwater. I also did shows on the flooding in, I believe, Nevada and Yellowstone Park, areas not historically prone to these heavy, heavy rainfalls. Now put that in context of even what last winter was like. You had Arctic blasts just drooping further south than they typically do into Texas. In much of Texas, much of their power grid being shut down by the extreme cold, freezing natural gas pipelines. Now this year, nationwide blizzards starting at the West Coast, moving east and going into the continental US and much of the northern area and Canada, accompanied with extremes of flooding and tornadoes. So the heat wave should be easy enough for the media. Everything's hotter, so there's just less cold to go around. But there's more to it than that. There's also the oceanic and atmospheric currents that I pointed out to you before. Well, these are just tied in with the pull and push from the cold Arctic to the warm equator. Well, as this phenomena called Arctic, sometimes referred to as Arctic amplification or feedback loops, kicks in, the Arctic's heating quicker than the rest of the planet. So feedback one you should have committed to memory is that as that Arctic ice is retreating, and I've shown you in NASA that's what it's doing, the Earth is losing its reflector to reflect heat off the planet. Then more heat is absorbed in that darker ocean because the ice is lost now, and then more ice is lost. So the process goes beyond all of the greenhouse gases that we, in quotes, have introduced into the atmosphere, trapping heat. Now Mother Nature's joining in the heating process. Another big feedback loop everyone should have committed to memory is that thawing permafrost in the Arctic releasing trapped methane or releasing trapped greenhouse gases. I believe I heard somewhere there is enough greenhouse gas trapped or enough methane or carbon trapped in that permafrost layer as has been released during the entire Industrial Revolution. So how would this heating Arctic affect, the up and downs of weather, the cold northern air just slumping south and the warm, hot tropical air pushing north. Well, here's how. Because those atmospheric and oceanic currents are now getting sluggish and out of whack. That's why you used to hear a lot of talk during those earlier cold Arctic blasts about something called a polar vortex. That polar vortex is an air current that sort of pins the northern cold air in place above the pole. Well, as these air currents like the jet stream become weaker and more sluggish or just more awkward, it just breaks out and slumps down further south than it normally would have. Another factor that I've shared with you before is this overall hotter atmosphere. It retains more moisture, and the warmer water bodies give up more moisture, leading to more extreme precipitation events, be it snow or rain. Now you get how the heating Arctic is affecting these ocean and atmospheric currents, bringing these like extreme cold snaps, even though the whole planet's hotter. Well, there was, when it comes to the ocean currents, like the Gulf Stream, that I've shared with you in the past also, that is slowing. But now here's where we get into the idea of we've maybe heard something really crazy sounding about global warming creating a new so-called ice age. Well, first of all, I believe the last ice age was brought to us by changes in the Earth's rotation or orbit or the axis, that kind of thing, not greenhouse gas concentrations. But that oceanic Gulf Stream brings warmer tropical waters up north and moderates the temperatures of the Northeast US, Canada, and Europe, Western Europe. So there was that movie The Day After, and it was premised on, what if that Gulf Stream just shut down and put those areas into a deep freeze? So this is bringing me to the point of we're getting into an all bets are off kind of climate. Because if things eventually do stagnate, you're not going to have these ups and downs maybe. It'll be a whole different situation we're now living with. So one message is take advantage of wind power when you can, because as far as I know, wind is generated by these cold and warm air masses coming together. If everything's stagnant, I don't see how that's going to work as well. And as these feedback loops are kicking in, the time to speak up is now. Well, let's get into the Western New York situation. So now regarding Buffalo and how many media pundits, meteorologists might try to normalize things as, oh, Buffalo cold and snowy. A lot of that goes back to they had that blizzard of 77, and that reputation just kind of stayed with them. But I've shared with you in the past also at EPA's climate change indicators, overall winters are trending warmer overall. Sometime back, I shared with you a NOAA article about how the lakes, the Great Lakes, are also having diminishing ice pack during winter over the years, indicating that region overall is warming. And if you look at weather reports preceding and following this Buffalo blizzard, you'll see that there was warmer temperatures, I believe pushing up towards the 50s, then an extreme dip in cold, and then back up again to warmer temperatures, from freezing to now everything melting and floods. Now, additionally, just based on anecdotal evidence of what a viewer familiar with Western New York shared with me, is that her recollection is that winters really began changing in the 90s in Western New York or Buffalo area. That cold, snowy, stereotypical winter of that region began getting replaced with like a cool, cold, clammy, then some Arctic cold blasts, and that was when it really began changing. Now that conforms also to my memory of those nationwide El Niños of the 90s that, again, the media could have talked about climate change but didn't. Additionally, back to that NOAA article I told you about with the lake ice diminishing, well, she also shared with me it used to be common in Western New York to go walking on the ice, maybe back to the 80s or 70s, and then after a while into the 90s, that became unsafe to do. Actually, knowing someone who did that, going on how Western New York or the Great Lakes used to be, Lake Erie in this case, and then walked out there and died. Really an early casualty of climate change, if you want to think of it that way. Another indicator of the warming winters in general is, I've shared with you in the past, CDC. The CDC has shown how the Lyme's disease-bearing ticks, their range has spread because the winters just don't typically get as cold and frozen as they used to. So now a lot of areas, and I believe the Buffalo area would be their greater region would be included in on this, now have ticks with Lyme's disease, when maybe going back 20 years ago, 15, I don't know how many, did not used to. So you have frozen lakes that are no longer safe to walk on, and you have wooded areas that are no longer safe to go traipsing through because of Lyme's disease. So your takeaways is I want you to realize that you can't really rely on our media system to warn us about this, because it's a similar situation to why it took so long to warn us about the harms, the dangers from tobacco. It was the power of that tobacco industry, their advertising, so on in the media. And it's the same now with the power of that fossil fuel petrochemical industry in our media, I believe. Secondly, there's no scientist whose exact job it is to warn us about this. They all have separate projects they're working on. And when you get one of them on the air, well, these are people who are trained in this heavy method, scientific methods of causation. They're going to watch every word, guard every word. And indeed, their whole careers are based on nitpicking, disagreeing, and this kind of thing. You can't rely on them to get out here ringing an alarm bell either. Well, some of them are, though. And I want you to realize none of this had to happen. I can remember that going back to Jimmy Carter's presidency when he said, put on a sweater to use less fuel. Everyone mocked him, or a lot of comedians did. Slow down, don't drive so fast. People weren't happy with that, Sammy Hagar. And he put solar panels on the White House. Start transitioning towards renewable. Well, Reagan came in, took those solar panels down, speed limits went back up, Americans started driving bigger vehicles again. None of this had to happen. Now we go years ahead, Bush v. Gore, right? Al Gore was going to keep us in this thing called the Kyoto Climate Convention. We're going to start limiting greenhouse gases. George Bush made fun of him. He won. He walked away from that Kyoto Convention. He invaded Iraq. So maybe one of my biggest messages, if you're voting Republican because of culture war issues, and I can understand some of that, okay? I can understand some of that. Don't, because we can always work out these culture war issues later, but destabilizing our climate, pumping this biosphere full of carcinogens and greenhouse gases, change exists in objective reality at the base level of chemical compounds and molecules. Well, hey, I hope you found this analysis helpful. Do not get lulled into that being that frog in the pot of boiling water. This is not, quote, normal. This is a heating planet set in motion by the excessive burning of fossil fuels and ignoring people who are trying to tell us to switch away, transition towards a greener, less toxic economy. And until next time, as always, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel, you're clicking that notification bell, you're commenting, liking. Donate at Patreon to make this effort sustainable for the host here. Thank you, Bella Grissi and Environmental Coffee House. And as always, peace be with you.